guest today is one of the leading thinkers in big data in healthcare and the pharmaceutical industry. Dr. Chris Boone is the Vice President and Global Head of Health Economics and Outcomes Research for AbbVie. He was previously the Vice President and Head of Global Medical Epidemiology and Big Data Analysis at Pfizer. Dr. Boone is also an adjunct professor at NYU and has nearly 20 years of experience at the intersection of health and technology as an executive, social entrepreneur, patient advocate, and futurist. Dr. Boone completed his PhD in public affairs at the University of Texas at Dallas, go Cowboys, and 2 executive programs at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. Chris, welcome to Chet Talks.
Thank you, sir. I got to admit, it's quite depressing when you say 20 years. I'm like, that makes me feel really, really old. We're going to get to the point, we're just going to cap it there. We're just going to say 20 plus thereafter.
When we have you back next year, we'll just do 20 plus. We'll keep it there.
Just leave it at 20. Yeah.
So, Chris, you're a self-described data hippie. So a data hippie should be able to give us a definition of big data. What's your definition of big data?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that big data itself is just really amassing this very varied and diverse types of data sets. I think, most of the time, if you think about traditional data management practices, whether they be just curating, processing, or analyzing the data, we're looking at a situation where data is so large and so varied that those traditional data management practices aren't adequate for what we're trying to do. But I do want to back into something really quickly that with the history behind the data hippie movement is that several years ago, when we were really focused on this idea of data democratization, that was really the impetus for it. I was hoping to really kind of catalyze the idea of data sharing across healthcare to really to drive some level of innovation. And honestly, at that time, I wasn't even working in pharma. I was actually leading the Health Data Consortium, and it was all about health data sharing or open data. But it's interesting now that 6 years later or so that I'm in the pharma world, I'm still advocating. Well, I guess it's interesting and depressing in some cases that we're still having the same discussions around the lack of data sharing that's there. And but now sitting on the pharma side of the fence, I have a fresh perspective, and honestly, I see the need, and I'm sure we'll get into this as part of our discussion, to really have data that's shared a bit more broadly across the industry to ensure that things such as, drug development is really reflecting, the populations that we need to really treat. And so anyway, so that's really a little bit about the whole data hippie moniker that I use.
So can you give us an example of where we're making progress on the data sharing front?
Initially when we were doing this, it was I almost think it was a very narrow scope. It was really just saying, even almost just addressing that interoperability issue of provider to provider relationships. Hey, can we just share data with each other and potentially make that data available to patients and consumers, right? But it always felt that, the ecosystem wasn't inclusive enough, so it was like I was advocating for this idea of open data, but it was in a very closed system, is what I like to say, meaning that when we were having many of these discussions, honestly, there were representatives from government or the public sector, there were representatives from providers, that you had the kind of professional medical societies and nonprofits. You had these different stakeholders that were at the table, but it didn't include like life sciences, which I thought was really, really interesting. One of the more critical stakeholders in the whole healthcare ecosystem. But I do think we've made some progress. Don't get me wrong. I think with some of the technologies that have been, and that are technological platforms that have been established, I think Apple Health Kit and Apple Research Kit were huge technologies for making this happen. Not only was I able to capture all of my data in a passive fashion, but I'm also able to then distribute that data to clinical studies that I think are relevant and of the utmost importance to Chris, right? And I think that's what. So I think that we've seen advances in these very novel approaches from big tech that's come into the fold to address many of these issues that we've been struggling with for a while.
So Apple Research Kit was launched in 2015. The first time really the idea of using smartphones, where's my
Yeah.
smartphone, to enable people to participate in research, an Apple endorsement here.
Yeah.
And 5 apps were used, one for asthma, breast cancer, diabetes, and Parkinson's disease was one of them. I can't remember what the third one is, I'm sorry. Or cardiovascular. And each of these enrolled anywhere from 10,000, tens of thousands of research participants in them. Is this a model for going forward?
I think it is the model. I really think, and not just simply because the technology makes it easier for patients and consumers to really participate, but I also think that you're seeing a societal shift or a cultural norm that's being established where patients are definitely wanting to own their own data, and they're definitely wanting to be more active and have a voice in how what their experiences have been with certain therapies and certainly, we've now placed a heavier weight or on the idea of patient-reported outcomes, right? And what the experience has been. And so I think these technologies only enable that. And you're hearing more and more now where people are demanding to have access to their data. Before, when they were demanding it, it was like they would go to whatever hospital records office and they would either give them this huge stack of papers and say, here you go on your merry way. Or if you were lucky, they may have downloaded it to some CD-ROM for you or, and handed it to you. You still don't know what to do with it. It was in a format that really wasn't readable to just, the average person. So I think now we've seen a number of standards that have come by. They make it simple. The Apple Health Kit, you can track these things. It can integrate with a number of health systems in the country. It's human readable, and you can actually, and you don't really necessarily have to do any manual data entry. That's the huge thing too, because if you think about it, when Microsoft had its Health Vault platform, I mean, one of the reasons I believe the adoption was so low was that people were like, I have to go in every single time and go in and manually type in whatever data was captured from my recent doctor visit, and that's just not a sustainable approach. So the more integration we have, the more human readable the data is, and thus you can actually drive behaviors and actions. I think the better off we'll be.
Do you see pharmaceutical companies embracing smartphones, other digital devices in their drug development programs?
Yeah, I don't think we really have a choice. I think the days of it being of optionality are done. I think biopharma has, and you're already seeing this. I mean, these organizations have been investigating most appropriate digital health technologies to engage with patients directly for a number of years now. But I think that where you're seeing now, you hear the term beyond the pill, where we have to demonstrate value beyond the pill, and that can be in the form of providing education to patients around their clinical conditions, ensuring the most appropriate, mechanisms to increase medication adherence, or certainly other things. And then also there's interest in understanding, hearing from the patient on what they're experiencing. I think that, and the most effective way to do that is through many of these digital technologies or apps or other things like that. I think that one of the challenges that we've faced as part of this is around the trust factor. I mean, it's I think that, and the more you hear it and it become much more politicized around the level of distrust to pharma from consumers, whether right, wrong, or indifferent, is something that we have to work on, and we have to establish that rapport and certainly show and demonstrate and prove that we're part of this and we're really looking out for the best interest of the patient, and that's incumbent upon us to do that.
So we're going to come to trust in a little bit. We're in the setting of a big public health challenge with COVID. Seems like a great opportunity for pharmaceutical industries to engender some trust with the communities.
And it has. I mean, or we have, right? If you think about it. I mean, I think if you looked at favorability polls and which is just beauty contests in many respects, I think there's been a greater appreciation for biopharmaceuticals in this current time, because I think people, and what it really boils down to is people getting a deeper understanding of what exactly we do and why, right? I think, the narratives that are out there, I won't even repeat them, but the different narratives that are out there, some may be grounded. I don't think all are necessarily true. But you really get an appreciation for in real time what life sciences actually does, and at the speed at which we're trying to move to address this pandemic. And it's really been truly an all hands on deck situation. And you don't hear anything about folks looking at this as an opportunity to really enrich themselves, but more so, how do we address this pandemic head on by getting a vaccine and or treatment out as fast as we possibly can. And let me go on the record and say that a number of companies has come out and said they can have it out by the end of the year or 2021. In either case, it would still be a record time for getting a drug approved, developed and approved. And so I think that's it's a remarkable feat, and I'm it's one of those moments that I think we don't talk about enough. When you think about all of the role that biopharma, and this is not, I'm not trying to make a pitch or sell people on why they should care about biopharmaceuticals, but if you think about all of the pandemics, viruses, or diseases that have been addressed and mitigated through the form of vaccines and our drugs, then you really got to say, wow, I mean, healthcare and public health more broadly has come a long way. And I think that, if we focus more on all of these things that have been addressed over the decades, you'll have a greater appreciation for what we do. But that's neither here nor there.
So one other big challenge for pharmaceutical companies is digital transformation. You shared this cartoon with me yesterday.
I can see it. Yeah.
Is this the pharmaceutical industry? Is this why you shared this to me?
I think it's every industry, man. Or we could pick on pharma if you want to do that, but I think we'll pick on pharma for the purpose of this discussion. But I think generally most industries all assume that their industry cannot be disrupted, and that goes all the way back to the Kodak, the Polaroids, the Blockbusters of the world, right? Or even travel, and you name it. You name the industry. I mean, even when it came to the media industry, we can go on and on. And so, but every single one has been disrupted at this point. And so I always think that it's interesting how folks have treated digital transformation, again, as if it's an optional pathway. It's a nice to have, right? And I think that in biopharma, we would certainly be fooling ourselves if we didn't embrace the idea of disrupting ourselves by embracing digital technologies and figuring out the new business and operating models that are necessary to go forward. I think there's a huge opportunity for many of the digital tech or information technology companies to come in and be disrupted by the mere fact. I mean, back to what we opened this conversation with, the level of data that they've amassed over the years and the understanding that they have of our patients and the people that are, of our patients about our products is powerful, and so there's a number of ways they can go there with. Now, obviously, this industry is certainly highly regulated, and many of these guys don't necessarily want to embark on that. And I think that there is, from their perspective, there's not a deep understanding of how drug development really works. But I do know that, in collaboration with a pharma company, we can do some extraordinary things. I mean, with the data that they've been able to collect and understand about people, and with our understanding of the drug development process and the regulatory landscape. So it's important that we think about ways to partner in the future.
Does that mean that the Google Alphabets and Verily of the world, that they're going to get more into drug development?
It's possible, right? I don't know what their strategic priorities are, but I'm certain that they've explored it. I think it seems that they've been kind of teetering on embarking in this. But I think people quickly realize that it's much more difficult than you think, right? Even and in the industry, it's much more regulated than most people presume, and so it's not as easy as it sounds.
You're a big fan of many of these digital technologies. Are there digital technologies that have you most excited?
Oh man, I mean, uh, I think the implantable technologies is certainly something that's fascinating. They talk about this idea of maybe one day having implantable cell phones in our, where you don't even need a cell phone. You just maybe it's a sensor implanted into your tongue or something. I don't know, and which I think is pretty funny. Because I feel like I've seen comedians speak about that in the past, and to think that that's an actual possibility is pretty hilarious. But I think the idea of neurotechnologies and the full understanding of the brain. I know President Obama was big into his Human Brain Initiative. That was one big thing, and working with other governments globally to really fully understand how the brain functions in certain environments is huge. Um, I as kind of the self-proclaimed environmentalist, I think the idea of smart cities and smart farming are two areas that are kind of outside of my day-to-day work, but I'm extremely fascinated by, from the simple fact that I think smart cities are more focused on obviously utilizing utilities or electricity more efficiently, with their kind of intelligent lighting, and even the idea of having a city with no street lights or stoplights is pretty interesting. I think Singapore is exploring that. And then when the smart farming, it's really about, I mean, most people they underestimate how progressive farming is when it comes to their adoption of digital technologies. And they do it through their tractors, which all have advanced technologies to assess climate and to assess when the most appropriate time is to farm, or how long foods will stay fresh, and when to plant and when not to plant. I think these things are quite fascinating how they've been able to do this. Um, the smart farming thing just really fascinates me. Maybe I'll do that in another life. Yeah.
So these applications to cities and farming, are these applications that you see that can be applied to drug development?
I do. I do think there's an opportunity to leverage learnings from other industries, and we certainly should be considering that at all costs. I mean, I think when it comes to obviously the use of artificial intelligence, we obviously very artificial intelligence and robotics. I mean, you can look at other industries. I mean, there are some parallels when it comes to manufacturing and supply chain, right? That's something that's consistent across all industries, and the more we can learn from industries that do it better, then the better off we'll all be.
We're getting lots of questions coming in. Just a reminder to the listeners, you can just go in the Q&A function and put in a question. We'll get to those to Chris momentarily. Before, I want to discuss two big social challenges that we're confronting as a country. One is race. The death of George Floyd has again highlighted the enormous disparities in this country. Do you want to talk about those disparities at a high level and then maybe focus on those in drug development?
Yeah, I mean, I think, wow. I mean, I don't want to say it's a loaded question, it's a heavy question, but it's something I think is near and dear to me. First of all, I've been talking about this issue around diversity in clinical trials for a number of years now, how that's certainly a big problem, but I'll come back to that. I think right now at the center of much of the Black Lives Matter protest has been police brutality. But I think there are other issues that are directly affect the African American community that should not go understated, and I do hear them talked about a little bit on the surface level. The one thing is obviously the criminal justice system. I mean, so you have police brutality, but then you got the criminal justice reform, which I know many political figures have discussed for a long time. And honestly, it's still disproportionately Black men, in the prison system. And so that's an unfortunate situation. I think the issue around Black wealth, which also leads into an issue around the quality of education in many of these communities, and many of the inequities you see there, or underinvestment. And then when I think about it from my vantage point, I think about the digital divide as one of those bigger issues and one of those bigger challenges. If you think about with COVID now, we're asking many of the students to now work, essentially through Zoom, like we're doing right now, right? And but if they don't have adequate like internet access or high speed internet, then how do you adequately do that? Or and then even when they're doing their work, you know, I'm finding that many of these students now are doing their work through their smartphones, which I think is very interesting. It probably shows how old I am too. But they're doing a lot of their work through the smartphones. Well, if you don't have a smartphone in order to do much of this, then you also run into challenges there. So I think you got issues around criminal justice reform. You got issues around Black wealth, quality education. But now let's jump into this issue around health. You know, when it comes to COVID, um, I'm still kind of, yeah, I'm flabbergasted by the fact that we have, you know, African Americans, 13% of the population, but yet 24, 25% of COVID cases, you know. And then you start to look at some of the numbers that are coming out around, you know, even if there were a vaccine created, many are still highly reluctant to be part of that that clinical trial or even use the vaccine, even if it's approved through some accelerated pathway. And so the question is why, though? You know, and I don't think those are always the issues. Or why don't we discuss the underlying issues that affect much of these issues around trust? Now, granted, there are some social determinant issues that affect one's ability to participate in a clinical trial, and people don't talk about that. I think the easiest thing to say is there's a distrust to the system, and obviously we're going to link that back, at least for the African American community, is the Tuskegee experiment, right? And but there's also issues around, well, if I have to commit to doing this clinical trial, I have to mix X number of days of work. I may not have child or even elder care for my parents. I just don't have, you know, they can't commit themselves to the regimen that's necessary for being a participant in a clinical trial. But then you also have this issue, and I remember I was speaking to the National Medical Association last year, and at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation conference that they have every September. And, you know, and my talk was really centered around this issue around diversity in clinical trials and how we can use real world evidence to really be an alternative path to addressing this issue. But one of the docs actually stood up and you know, and really kind of planted seed in my head around the issue that he believes the reason that we see such low participation from minorities, specifically African Americans, in clinical trials has more to do with the fact that they don't trust docs who don't look like them, right? So, so then, you know, I was like, oh, so I'm up here thinking about in terms of data and not addressing the core issue, which is it's that person-to-person contact to say that I just want a doctor I trust a doctor more who looks like me, who's telling me about this clinical trial than I do someone who doesn't. And so I think there's a number of issues to address when it comes to the issues of or challenges associated with minority participation in clinical trials. And but I think they all can be addressed. You know, it's just a matter of
so just some data on the digital divide. 20% of households, one of every 5 households in the U.S. doesn't have access to broadband, and one of every 5 households doesn't have a smartphone. So, you know, things that, you know, you and I take for granted are far from universal. And then on the clinical trial front, so one study found that participation in minorities in cancer clinical trials has actually decreased in the past 14 years. And then from one of our colleagues in clinical trials in Parkinson's disease, only 17% of studies reported participation by race at all. 83% didn't even comment on race.
Yeah. You're looking at that study from JAMA, I'm assuming, right?
Yeah.
Because I saw that one too, and that's one that I've referenced before, and I know that the FDA has certainly have been motivated. I mean, they've actually issued some regulatory guidance around how to improve diversity in clinical trials, and to the point where it will be consideration for getting your actual drug approved. And I know that many pharma companies have made, at least as of late, a concerted effort to address that issue. But it's difficult. You can create the environment, but the people, it's not as simple as build and they will come. I think that you have to go and meet people where they are, and that's just something that we have to be better about.
So maybe Abby can put the link to the article Dr. Boone was referencing is by Dr. Vivek Murthy, Murthy. He's the former Surgeon General of the United States on clinical trial participation by race. It was published in JAMA. Recently, Chris, you retweeted a speech by Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in which he said, "In the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard." What aren't we hearing?
Man, and I got no likes from that tweet. No, I think that the reality is that we spoke about this earlier when we talked about the deeper issues in the community. I think that people have been, and I'll give you a real example from me personally. At one of my in one of my positions, I won't mention the company. I was dealing directly with some microaggressions from coworkers or coworker, and I remember I voiced to someone who was a non-Black individual, and their response was, "Are you sure you're just not being overly sensitive? Are you sure that's what's really happening?" And so here it is. I'm obviously not a very sensitive guy, I don't think, but nonetheless, I've expressed this concern or this frustration, and the response I got back was, "Are you sure that's basically not all in your head?" And so, if you think about the spirit of that quote, it's really saying that, people who've expressed how they felt, they've expressed their frustration for many, many years, and it just goes unheard, unseen. That's all in your head. It really doesn't exist. And, you think about Will Smith, who actually said one of the more profound statements, who made one of the more profound statements about this whole issue after George Floyd's death. It's really, he said that, it's not that it's gotten worse, it's just getting filmed, right? And so here we are in a situation where people, we as people have been voicing and this frustration and these experiences for many, many years, and people just ignored it. And it's not until you have evidence that you can't deny that that people now believe it. And so I think, and then what makes it worse is that even with the evidence there, as we've seen as of late, there's still no consequences for it. And so really that's where you are. I mean, it's just, I'm not an advocate for rioting or looting, but also I can empathize with the frustration as being someone who's been a victim of it myself. And so that's really what I meant in the spirit of that particular quote from the great MLK.
So more listening to be done. We got some questions.
More actions to be done. I mean, it's listening. It's listening, but I mean, we can talk till we're blue in the face. I mean, my whole thing is that, let's do something about it. I think, I think now everyone's, oh, well, let's talk about it. It's like, yeah, we can talk about it, I think, but can we just do something in the meantime? Can we not do these things in parallel or in conjunction with one another? Can we listen and do? Do we have to? Does it have to be like this sequential process? We're going to listen for 5 years or 10 years, and then we'll do something. It's like, I think people want to see something done now.
Good. I might come back to you at the end and ask you what we should be doing. First, I'm going to give the floor to some of our listeners. Derek Bowen asks, technology aside, sitting inside a large pharmaceutical company, do you see any movement toward flexibility for data sharing?
As far as, I guess the question, and I don't know if he means referencing clinical trial data or real world data, which are two different things. And when I'm using the term real world data, it's kind of big data, but it's data that's captured outside of the clinical trial. And I know that when it comes to clinical trial data sharing, there's been a number of initiatives that's been happening, and many pharmaceutical companies are actively contributing their data to different sites in order to publish and make that accessible to researchers who are qualified to do these types of analyses. But when it comes to the other non-clinical trial type of data, we're still in this point where, when I think about, it's not data sharing, it's more like data transactions, like where you have data aggregators who are essentially curating data, and then they are packaging it and selling it to pharma. What I would like to see is what I feel is much more of a learning health system, where we are working in collaboration with providers and payers and patients to really understand how our therapies work in the real world. And then you're getting real-time feedback, which then allows providers to then adjust their own clinical practice protocols. But it also allows us to learn from those patient experiences, and we incorporate those learnings back into the drug development process. That's what I really hope. So it doesn't always have to be like, I'm going to take this data and I'm going to send it to you, Ray. It could be like you and I could be sitting together. You can be collecting this data. We're reviewing it and we're running these studies together, and we're learning from those experiences that we both use those findings to make to either further clinical practice or clinical research.
On the clinical practice side, Mina Atten asked, what kind of advances have been used for using electronic health records of hospitalized patients to conduct clinical research? Can you give an example?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of companies that are doing these very things. I mean, obviously, Flatiron, Coda come to mind. I mean, these guys, I know Coda signed a deal with the FDA, which they're, kind of going into this whole idea of understanding, response rates with certain therapies in certain subpopulations. That's exactly what they're doing. They're using much of that EHR data to do that. The problem that we have is that many of these EHR platforms weren't designed for clinical research. They were more designed for probably more payer reimbursement, and at best clinical documentation for the physician, but they aren't. It isn't the same quality of data that we would necessarily capture and curate from a randomized clinical trial. And so I think that where the opportunity is for us to improve the data quality that's captured in EHRs to make it more, we'll say, higher quality for a clinical research person. But there are a number of situations where I've had a number of conversations with different health systems who are particularly interested in getting into the world of clinical research, specifically drug development, by partnering with pharma in order to do that. And so I do think those things will get better.
Dr. Ravi Ramchandran, our friend, asked, while the time for adding smart devices in clinical studies is long past, there are no common set of data standards. Access to raw data coming out of the devices is spotty, nor do we necessarily know how the algorithms are processing the raw data to give us insights. How do we successfully incorporate and trust the data in our clinical trials?
We don't right now. I mean, I do think that there are a number of initiatives where folks are focused on developing standards for data collection and improving the standards. I know FHIR has certainly been the standard of choice for many of us. I do think too, but the algorithms point is a very, very interesting. So yes, you have the lack of data standards for what we capture and in what format it's actually captured in. That's one. But then you got this lack of visibility and transparency into the algorithm and what's happening behind. The whole black box effect is what is going to be. I think it's going to be a huge problem if we don't address it. And I think that I don't want to say that that's where the regulator should step in, but I do think there needs to be some level of oversight as we continuously adopt more and more AI technologies into the discovery and development process. And there's going to have to be some level of visibility into this algorithm and its data source, and essentially how it's getting to the output that it's getting to. And so it may be a point where we're, not only as part of the dossier that we're submitting to regulators, you're also submitting the algorithm itself. So it's, you find a situation where potentially the data source and the algorithm are just as important as the drug itself as part of regulatory approval. And I think that's certainly a possibility.
And Mary Beth Arzak asked some questions about sharing data with patients. Have you thought about the individualized data sharing based on what's most important to the patient.
Yeah, and I'm assuming they're talking clinical trial data or
They didn't
or
say.
just data sharing in general. And so it's funny because last year I know there was that last year or early this year where we had the big discussion, and I know that HHS was releasing its guidance around data sharing, and you had a number of what was actually Judy Faulkner at Epic, and then a number of health systems that signed on to her letter that were refuting the idea, and the rationale was that, kind of putting this data in the hands of patients and allowing them to kind of share it wherever would somehow pose some privacy concerns and some privacy issues. I've always been an advocate, as you know, of giving the data back to the patient in any form. I don't care if it's clinical trial data or if it's just data that they get from their provider. And it's really their prerogative as far as how they want to use it. But I do think that folks should understand the unintended risk of and potential risk of making that data available and them sharing it. And I don't know if that's I don't know if we're doing enough education around that part. But the idea of sharing the data, that to me is non-negotiable. It's just more so of like, what guardrails can we put in place to ensure people don't inflict unnecessary damage on themselves, and that's really where I fall with that.
Cheryl Fitzer Addis, one of our friends, asked, how do you see digital health outcomes being incorporated into payer decisions in the US?
Oh man, that's going to be huge. I think that most pharma companies are focused on building out that capability and strengthening it when it comes to certainly the many of the PROs, and I think that I think the question, what I'm hearing that question to be is a question around value, right? And then when you think about value, there's multiple perspectives or dimensions of value. Obviously, you have the clinical value piece, which obviously many of them care about. You have the economic piece. You have this kind of societal or humanistic perspective, which is like, how does it affect essentially your quality of life and improve it? And then it becomes more or less, if the patients feel that, hey, while this may not be a curative therapy, if it extends my life or improves my quality of life now, I place a higher value on that. So really, I think you'll see the conversation shift more to value, and a lot of that has been driven by how does the patient feel about value, and what do they define as value for them, and that's based on the clinical, economic, humanistic perspective of value.
Dr. Adam Dicker from Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia asks about the digital divide. He says, we have a population of patients with no cell phone or internet. Due to COVID, we can't send someone to onboard them. Do you have thoughts or suggestions?
To onboard patients for the clinical trial?
Clinical trials, or I think even for clinical care, especially if they don't have cell phone or internet.
That goes back to the limited broadband issue. I think that, to me, when I think about the digital divide, I could be on an island by myself. When I think about internet access, to me, it seems like a public good. It should just be available. I don't understand why people have to pay for internet access in the U.S. to me. And so that's number one. And I think that what's been interesting about this kind of this whole the whole pandemic is that the increase in the adoption of telehealth mechanisms. I mean, I know that many folks who've never used it are using it now. So that's interesting. I also think when it comes to the idea of doing virtual clinical trials with with remote and digital technologies, I expect that would come up, would be technologies that would increase in prevalence as well. But as far as addressing it, the only way to address it, honestly, the broadband issue, is to make it a public good and make it available to everybody. Yeah, that's my solution.
So just another solution out there is we've seen some individuals have done for homeless populations in which they give cell phones, smartphones to the homeless as a means for connecting people to healthcare and other social services. Yeah. One of your friends, Jawad Sartaj, says, Chris, as always, thank you for your insights. You mentioned data interoperability, and I would offer there are 5 perspectives: patients, providers, payers, policymakers, and product companies. How do we get consensus or traction in this area so that data democratization can move from ideation to reality?
I think that where we have and where it's been always a struggle for me is that people, when it comes to data democratization, they've all defined it differently. And until we come to this shared vision as to what it is, then it becomes challenging to move from ideation to implementation because of it. I think, folks, there's certainly philosophical debates. I mean, that's been a whole industry been created around monetizing data assets, and so I think that part poses presents a barrier to the idea of data democratization, and I think that we, as part of defining and coming up with a shared vision, we have to scope what it means and what it includes and what it doesn't, right? So until we get to that place, I'm not sure we can move, and that's part of the reason that we're still where we are. I mean, there obviously are technological challenges that I think can be addressed, but I think in large part there needs to be some common interests or some shared perspectives on what it looks like, and that's the challenge. I mean, I gave you the example of Judy and those health system administrators who were opposed to the idea of allowing patients to have access to their data and be able to do whatever they want with it. So you still have some key figures who are opposed to this idea of effectively democratizing data for the public good, which is what I believe.
A couple more questions they're going to ask you about what we should be doing. Tony Bannon asks, can you comment on how we navigate working with regulatory agencies when trying to deploy digital technologies in drug development?
My biggest advice, man, is to start early. Never has there been a time where regulators, the FDA specifically, have been so open to partnering with industry and with the private sector on coming up with solutions than they are now. I mean, a lot of the stuff, it goes back as far as, even under Bob Califf and then Scott Gottlieb and now the current administrator, where they are, or current commissioner, where they are very, very focused on the idea of partnering with the private sector to come up with solutions. So I think when we think about it in terms of even potentially submitting, submitting or partnering with the FDA to submit and really figure out how we better leverage or accelerate the use of real world evidence studies, it starts early with, hey, we're thinking about this. What's your thought? What's your reaction? So it's almost like you're brainstorming with the regulators. And I think that the more we can do that with digital technologies, in addition to many of these real world data studies, the better. So advice, practical advice, engage with them early, pitch the concept, see what the reactions are, let them poke holes in it, and just keep that dialogue open. And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised in what you can get from it.
Alexa Burke, picking up on real world evidence, she leads real world evidence at Citizen. She asks, Chris, can you please speak to the benefits and limitations of obtaining patient consent for data sharing and real world evidence?
Hi, Alexa. Well, I mean, she said the benefit and risk of getting, you said obtaining consent.
Yes, as opposed
yeah,
to.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that informed consent is paramount. But I think that we can't, the biggest challenge has been, the terms and conditions. It's almost like when I go and do my iTunes account and they give me these long list of terms and conditions that I don't always read. And I'm sure most people don't read because it's in legalese. And so we have to find a way to simplify that language in layman's terms for people to be able to fully understand what they can and cannot do and what will and won't be done with their data as part of participating in the study. And so simplifying it and making it a bit more straightforward for people is one way to obtain informed consent. But if I'm hearing it correctly, is it a question around, is that important or not? Or is it how should we do it? I guess.
How should we do it as opposed to a more passive model of patient involvement without consent for sharing their data for secondary research purposes?
Oh, for secondary research. Now that gets, that really gets really tricky for the simple fact that sure, you can do some upfront consent, but I think people, many people assume that on the pharma side that we are seeing identifiable data when all the data we get is de-identified. So let's be clear on that. I think we should dispel any myths that are out there about the types of data that we're actually acquiring. And so, but yeah, I mean, I think that from my perspective, I would hope that many of the partners that we engage with are actually ensuring that consent is established before they engage with us, right? So that to me should be a standard and the norm and not the exception.
Howard Rice asked, telemedicine video conferencing could be a great tool for clinical trial recruitment and retention. Do you think this could be one way for pharma companies and contract research organizations to increase participation of minorities?
Yeah, I do. I think one of the big opportunities we have, and even going back to this COVID situation, some of the challenges that some of the drug manufacturers were experiencing was recruitment for their phase 2 or 3 trials that they were conducting. And the reality is that if we were better leveraging much of the real world data, real world evidence we had out there, we'll get a better sense of essentially where many of the patients were. It's almost like a hot spotting technique. And we can get a sense of feasibility of certain inclusion and exclusion criteria for recruiting those patients. Sometimes we can outline very rigid, and rightfully so, very rigid inclusion exclusion criteria for clinical trials, but we don't really have a sense of, well, how many patients can we recruit based on that those established criterion. And I think that what the big data sources give us is an insight into, okay, well, what's realistic, what's practical, and then where are these patients, so you can start to do some level of site feasibility. So I think we have to start using our big data sources to really optimize how we design many of our studies, and that should start much earlier than it has been.
So Chris, I'm going to ask you an easy question, a light question, and a heavy one to close. You love thinking about the future. You're a Dallas Cowboys fan. Does the NFL return in the fall?
Yes, Cowboys fan. Yes, NFL returns. Maybe limited fans in the stands, and yes, we are Super Bowl bound. If that was going to be a next question.
You heard it from Chris Boone first.
Yeah.
Cowboys returning to the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
So earlier, we were talking about Reverend Martin Luther King and the need to listen, but you said we need to listen and do. We need to do something. What do we need to do?
Well, I mean, obviously, there's multiple levels of it. I mean, obviously, from a policy perspective, we have to address many of the issues that we've already discussed in this conversation. I think that, and I think that, when people think of policy, they still always assume federal policy. There are things that we can do at the local levels too. And I actually tend to think a lot more gets done at the local levels, at the local municipality level, and even the state levels than what we get at the federal level. So we have to address the issues that we know would actually have maximum impact. And I think we're talking surface level things, and I think people are politicizing this Black Lives Matter movement right now. And but I think there are things that corporations can do beyond just donating money to a nonprofit. There are things that they can do internally if they reflect on their own policies and procedures, whether it be through their hiring practices, whether it be through ensuring recruiting and retention, right? I mean, it's one thing to recruit, it's another thing to retain. And creating those environments where there's some level of equity and ability for folks to really thrive. I think when it comes to, we talk a lot about the broadband, the digital technologies, and how that has effects not just on education, which we also talked about the ability to engage with providers and participate in clinical trials. So you start to really get into some of these underlying issues that can be addressed if we want them to. And so I think we just need to identify what those are and address those. We shouldn't politicize broadband access. That is what it is. It benefits everybody, right? Um, and so these are the types of things or examples I think that we can address, and we can address in the near term, and it doesn't have to be a decade from now.
So let's work to address them now. Chris, thank you very much for your insights and thoughts on a wide range of topics. On our next Check Talk on Tuesday, June 16th at noon Eastern, we'll be speaking with former U.S. Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle. Chris, you warmed up the audience for Senator Daschle. Few people know more about data than Dr. Chris Boone. Few people know more about healthcare and health policy than Senator Daschle. If you want to know what the future holds, join us next Tuesday. He may even share some insights on the upcoming elections, which I hear we have in November. Until then, the Center for Health and Technology at the University of Rochester thanks you all